Imagine reading your enemy's diary as he sails to battle. Every movement, every plan, laid bare. At Midway, the Americans did exactly that. Almost 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy strode confidently across the Pacific. Yet beneath that confidence, unseen hands were at work. In dim rooms at Station HYPO, American cryptanalysts chipped away at JN-25, the Japanese naval code, assembling meanings from fragments like archaeologists of a living war. What they found was not merely a date or a place, it was a blueprint Operation MI, a move on Midway designed to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into destruction. Admiral Nimitz didn't just read the plan, he inverted it. He placed his scarce carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered but battle-ready Yorktown, at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway, under strict radio silence. The island itself became a forward set of eyes, crammed with aircraft that could scout far and strike if needed. This intelligence coup turned uncertainty into geometry. Rather than rushing blindly to defend everything, Nimitz accepted risk. Battleships were sidelined, carriers became the fist. Reconnaissance priorities reflected that mindset. PBYs raked the sea, while Midway's radar and patrols stretched the island's senses. Timing would be everything. If the U.S. could launch first, they could catch Japanese decks crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft. A carrier's most vulnerable heartbeat, the Japanese expected surprise. The Americans planned one. Point Luck wasn't just a coordinate, it was a trapdoor. By positioning their task forces where Japanese search patterns were thin and the approach vectors favored American dive, bomber range, Nimitz and his subordinates, Fletcher in overall command and Spruance, leading Task Force 16, stacked the odds against a numerically superior foe. Even Yorktown's rapid patch up became part of the deception. The Japanese believed she had sunk at Coral Sea. She would reappear as a ghost with teeth. As dawn broke on June 4, the PBY sightings began to thread the final needle. Reports of many ships and carriers flowing from Midway to the carriers confirmed what Station HYPO had predicted. The U.S. was not reacting to the Japanese move, it was springing its own. In an ocean where chance often reigns, intelligence gave the Americans the rarest advantage of all, the ability to choose the moment. That choice would decide the fate of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the course of the Pacific War, of timing, of surprise, of doctrine. His air groups had just hammered the island's facilities, but the strike had not fully neutralized Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Commander Tominaga, leading the first wave, radioed for a second attack to finish the job. A routine rearm and refuel for another island strike began. Torpedoes stowed, armor, piercing bombs exchanged for general-purpose ordnance. Decks crowded with aircraft and fuel lines. Doctrine discouraged piecemeal attacks. Nagumo preferred a single, concentrated blow. Then, a reconnaissance report cut across the plain. Enemy ships, at least 10, were near. Were there carriers among them? The report did not say. Here lay the crux: strike immediately with the ready aircraft armed for land targets, or wait to recover the Midway strike, rearm for ship attack, and then hit with full force. The first choice risked dribbling strength and losing aircraft to fuel starvation. The second risked yielding the initiative altogether. Time, always slender on a carrier deck, thinned to a wire. Nagumo chose to wait, recover, confirm, rearm, then strike. It was a decision grounded in doctrine and caution, but it intersected with an American plan designed to punish hesitation. While Japanese decks became a forest of wings and hoses, U.S. carrier groups, guided by sightings, groped toward Nagumo's task force. The Combat Air Patrol, dozens of Elite Zero pilots, climbed and dove to swat away low, brave torpedo planes from Midway, and the carriers burning fuel and attention at sea level. Every minute of delay multiplied risk. The shifting of ordnance back and forth. Torpedoes out, bombs in, then torpedoes back. Created chaos below decks. Fuel, vapors, and munitions formed an invisible minefield awaiting a spark. The elegant choreography of carrier warfare faltered under the weight of competing priorities. Finish Midway. Guard against carriers. Conserve planes. Launch a decisive wave. In this crucible, doctrine. No piecemeal. Met reality. Piecemeal pressure from all directions. The Americans didn't need to win every skirmish, they needed Nagumo to pause. When dive bombers finally arrived overhead, Japanese fighters were dragged down by repeated, low-level attacks, and decks below were primed with fuel and explosives. Nagumo's dilemma wasn't merely a tactical puzzle, it was the hinge upon which the battle swung. In an arena where minutes decide navies' fates, the choice to wait gave the enemy exactly the window they needed. The first waves that found Nagumo's carriers were not the war-winning dive bombers but the men of the torpedo squadrons, devastators flying low and slow into a storm. From Hornet came VT-8, from Enterprise, VT-6, from Yorktown, VT-3. Their aircraft were obsolete, their torpedoes unreliable, and their approach demanded a steady, sacrificial line at mast height, straight at the teeth of the Kido Butai. Yet their mission was not only destruction. It was distortion. Drag the Japanese combat air patrol down and fix their gaze at sea level. They did. VT-8's 15 TBDs, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, pressed home without fighter escort. One after another, they fell, hammered by Zeros and shipboard fire, tracer lines stitching the sky. Not a single torpedo struck home, nearly every plane was shot from the air. Waldron and his men gave everything. Moments later VT-6 arrived, and then VT-3, fresh targets for the cap, more low-level threads to pull every fighter downward. Against blazing decks and weaving carriers, the devastators kept coming, stoic in outdated machines, pilots wrestling controls, rear gunners spitting defiance until silence. The tactical impact was paradoxical: disaster in results, triumph in effect. The Zero pilots, masters of climb and roll, were now fighting at the waves, fuel clocks ticking, ammunition belts thinning. Their altitude, the carrier's shield against the sudden scythe of a dive bomber, was traded for immediate, necessary defense against the torpedo lines. Japanese decks could not launch a counterstrike while being assailed. The ballet of carrier operations froze mid-step. Above the fray, unseen for those desperate minutes, Enterprises and Yorktown's dive bombers hunted. Bad coordinates and wide ocean had split formations, but persistence and a fortunate sighting of the destroyer Arashi's wake guided Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey toward the carriers. The torpedo squadrons, destroyed in detail, had purchased an opening their crews would never live to see. Their sacrifice bent the geometry of the fight, turning fighter vectors and timing to American advantage. War often asks impossible things of ordinary men. At Midway, the devastators paid in blood for seconds and angles. For a KP that was out of position and low on fuel at the moment that mattered. When history records the sudden inferno that consumed 3 Japanese carriers, it should also whisper the names of those who flew straight into guns so that others, falling from the sun, could deliver the decisive blows. They came from a clear sky that moments before offered only heat haze and sea glare. Enterprise's VB-6 and VS-6, with Yorktown's VB-3 converging, rolled over into near, vertical dives that turned ships into targets painted on blue water. Kaga and Soryu, decks cluttered by refueling lines, bombs, and planes, filled the dive bombers' sights. With Japanese fighters dragged low by the torpedo attacks, the high cover was thin. Bomb bay doors yawed, dive brakes screamed, and bombs fell like iron punctuation. Kaga took the first sentences. 4 direct hits walked her length, plunging through wooden flight deck into hangars, where aviation fuel and armed aircraft waited like tinder. Fire flashed outward, then inward, decks buckling as compartments pressurized with flame. Soryu's turn followed, 3 hits that cracked her vitals. Within minutes, both carriers were furnaces. Damage control fought hard, but the chemistry of gasoline, oxygen, and steel made mercy unlikely. Men leapt, hoses hissed, explosions rolled like drumbeats. Akagi, the flagship, seemed spared until a final, critical decision in a split second. Lieutenant Richard Best, seeing Kaga already doomed and Akagi unmarked, dragged 2 wingmen with him across the sky to the flagship. In a dive sharpened by training and chance, he planted a 1,000-pound bomb near the rear elevator. It punched through, found the hangar, and turned a deck full of fueled aircraft into a chain of detonations. A single accurate hit, delivered at precisely the wrong moment for the defenders, crippled the nerve center of the Kido Butai. On the sea's surface, Japanese destroyers corkscrewed to avoid more bombs, their wakes sketching frantic white arcs. Above, Dauntlesses clawed for altitude, engine straining, flak puffing black flowers in their path. In the span of roughly 5 minutes, the balance of the Pacific War tilted. The invincible aura of the Kido Butai, Pearl Harbor's hammer, was broken not by battleships trading broadsides, but by dive bombers exploiting a sliver of time when decks were most vulnerable. The crews aboard the stricken carriers were disciplined and brave, fighting to contain the Holocaust below decks, jettisoning munitions, flooding, steering with engines when rudders failed. But fires seeded in hangars are a carrier's doom. By afternoon, Soryu and Kaga were fatally wounded. Akagi would linger, her admiral refusing to leave until ordered. The Americans had lost scores of planes and men. Yet the exchange, 3 carriers for air groups, was strategically priceless. The window the torpedo squadrons bought had been used with ruthless precision. Amid wreck and flame, 1 Japanese carrier remained a sword in the scabbard Hiryu under Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, with a cool decisiveness that marked him as among the IJN's finest carrier leaders. Yamaguchi launched what strength he had left. Lieutenant Kobayashi's dive bombers, escorted by Zeros still eager and lethal, found Task Force 17. Yorktown, patched and proud, her crew seasoned, maneuvered hard as bombs fell in intricate patterns. 3 strikes and 2 near misses jarred her steel, fires blossomed, and she slowed, a wounded queen amid destroyer screens. Damage control aboard Yorktown was a practiced art. Teams swarmed below decks, engines coaxed back to life, fire mains fed like arteries, and the ship breathed again. To the Japanese spotters turning for home, the carrier seemed mortally hit. Yamaguchi, hearing of success, chose to press. The second wave, a makeshift strike under Tamanaga, lifted. They found what they believed was a fresh target. In reality, it was the same resilient ship. Wildcat fighters tore into the approach, and Tamanaga, flying a damaged plane, dived first. Torpedoes foamed white trails. The first string missed. The second did not. 2 hits clawed Yorktown's port side, knocking life from her motion, rolling her with a cruel list. Still, she did not die. American eyes were not idle. Enterprise's dive bombers, 25, Dauntlesses led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, followed the spoor of reports and the logic of retreat. They found Hiryu late in the day, with only a dozen Zeros aloft and too few minutes to reshuffle defense. Bombs fell, 4 solid hits walked into Hiryu's heart. Hangars erupted, flame lifted from deck seams. The carrier that had bloodied Yorktown was itself mortally struck. Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard, a samurai's end in a modern war, while his crew abandoned ship. Even as Hiryu burned, the Japanese sought to claw back advantage with surface forces, submarines, and bold maneuver. A submarine would later seal Yorktown's fate. Torpedoes from I-168 struck the carrier again and tore the destroyer Hammond apart as she lent power and pumps to the salvage. Courage radiated from both sides' fire parties, fighting amid detonations, pilots landing on decks, glazed with fuel, destroyers threading seas littered with survivors and debris. By nightfall of June 4, the duel between Hiryu and Yorktown had become a grim epilogue to the day's main act. A testament to endurance and the last sharp edges of a wounded fleet. Midway's ledger was written in carriers and aircrews. The U.S. tally of loss was grievous: 144 aircraft, and ultimately, the carrier Yorktown. Yet the strategic trade shattered Japan's offensive arm. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were gone. Their elite pilots and deck crews lost in numbers that industrial capacity alone could not replace. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kido Butai was more than hardware. It was a cadre, a culture, and a tempo of war honed from China to Pearl Harbor. In one day, that tempo broke. Production lines could lay new decks, but not resurrect experience at speed. The Japanese plan's weaknesses were exposed: dispersion of force with the Aleutian feint, delayed submarine screens, insufficient reconnaissance coverage, and the doctrinal rigidity that discouraged adaptive, piecemeal responses just when the situation demanded them. Yamamoto's grand design, to lure the Americans into decisive battle and annihilate them, was inverted by codebreaking and precise American risk-taking. Nimitz's bet on carriers, Spruance's cool refusal to be drawn into a night surface action, and Fletcher's steady command combined into a posture that seized the moment and then declined at unnecessary hazards. For the United States, Midway shifted initiative. No longer fighting with their backs to Hawaii, American forces could move on to the offensive. Guadalcanal loomed only weeks away. The psychological effect mattered, too. Allies saw that the invincible IJN could be outfoxed and outfought. On the Japanese side, confidence curdled into caution. Irreplaceable pilots, lost at Midway, would be missed in every subsequent engagement from the Solomons to the Philippine Sea. Midway also rewrote the naval playbook in the public mind. The age of the battleship as arbiter of sea power was eclipsed by flight decks and pilots, by radar plots and code rooms. The heroes were not only those who flew, but those who listened to ciphers, who patched boilers at sea, who fought fires with their bare hands and salt water. Decisive victory was not a thunderhead of shells, but a 5-minute window of bombs on vulnerable decks. Created by sacrifice, exploited by skill, secured by restraint. If this deep dive clarified how a handful of minutes reshaped the Pacific War, tell us what moment struck you most. Drop a comment, hit like to support more animated history, and share this episode with a friend who loves WWI stories. Your feedback steers our next campaign.